happy to be here. This has been so far such an incredible experience. I'm just loving it. And I think there are very few people here who are not owed a thank you for making this such a nourishing conference. So I'm going to extend just blanket gratitude. So I've been working on a book since 2016 about land and property rights. It traces the, glasses would make this so much easier. So it traces the destructive path of private property law from England to South Africa and back to the US. This book is theoretically composed of 4 very long, arduous essays. Only 2 have been drafted so far. I'm not going to subject you to either one of them. Instead, I'm going to read from my cheat project, my side project, the place where I go to have a little fun. These are a series of very short essays. They're all under 800 words. And I've been writing these as a gardening column for the magazine Orion. Huge thanks to Tasha Eason, who is the editor-in-chief, and she's here as a fellow, working tirelessly to keep Orion going as funding is falling away right and left. So grateful. And my gardening column is titled Cruel Gardening. And I've decided after yesterday's craft talk that gardening is my professional wrestling. If the name Mankind wasn't already taken, that would be my moniker. So as I read from my column, just imagine that here I am in the wrestling ring of the garden, Mankind, crashing down from my corner to performatively thrash my opponent, the plants. This first piece is titled Force. It isn't nice, gardening, and it isn't natural. It's done by force, mostly, what isn't done by time or accident. Simple force, a shovel driven into the earth, roots severed, tiny tunnels collapsed, naked grubs exposed. Many small catastrophes within the dark world of a single whole. The force of gardening isn't incidental. It's the primary pleasure, the pleasure of making something happen. You hear the lack of this pleasure in the resignation on the other end of the phone, in the voice that says, "There's nothing I can do. I don't make those decisions." The vacancy left by unsatisfying work isn't filled by leisure, but by work in the garden, where you indulge in blunt and basic force. Force is the gardening term for making a plant flower or fruit ahead of season. Rhubarb can be forced into early growth with just an overturned bucket, but clay bells are specially made for that purpose, cast in terracotta, identical to relics from the 19th century. In her 1910 Manual of Gardening, Liberty Hyde Bailey describes the forcing hill that can be used to bring earlier yields of rhubarb. The forcing hill is made by putting a box over the plant and piling soil or manure around the outside, so the plant is growing inside a small hill, insulated from the frost. A series of sketches illustrate the evolution of this concept through insulating infrastructure. Wooden frames with a hinged lid, then frames set over a bed of manure, then a larger structure sunk into the ground deep enough for a person to stand inside with a glass roof and a trough full of manure. The next sketch includes pipes for hot water, revealing where all this is going, towards plants forced to grow indoors. In Japan, the Hatsumono strawberry, the first of the season, can be sold for many times the price of later strawberries. Most of the strawberries in Japan now come from gas-heated greenhouses, and the first of the season arrives in December rather than April. the open-air strawberries of early spring, reddened by the midday sun while still holding the chill of night in their white hearts, are grown elsewhere and shipped in. That's farming. The force of the market isn't felt in the garden, not so much as the inevitable force of the earth tilting on its axis, the approach of the killing frost that brings the tragedy of bad timing. There's a strange pleasure in this, too, in meeting the demands of the season, in being driven by time as your sole overseer. I don't force rhubarb, as I'm not alert enough to get ahead of it. Rhubarb is my clock, the emergence of those first crinkled leaves from their tight cowl, announcing that it's time to begin work in the garden, and that I'm likely already late. Rhubarb commands the first planting. Press a seed into the soil and you light a fuse that will uncoil underground. At first, there's only a slight swelling, almost imaginary, a fragment of dirt displaced. Then the seed casing splits and the chardlings unfold their long leaves and stand up on their slender pink stems like a flock of flamingos. Some will be lost to damping off, a sudden shriveling of the transparent stem, the whole plant collapsed, or scratched out of the ground by an unseen animal, or gnawed off by an army of pillbugs marching out of last fall's leaves, tiny tanks rambling across the low terrain. It isn't easy gardening. Any force applied to the project of making something grow is met with an array of opposing forces. This, the sensation of force meeting force, is invigorating in its way, or at least edifying. When else do you feel it? The palpable pressure of an ecosystem, the weight of other kinds of life bearing down on your own, the limits of your own will? Thank you. That one is better than this one, in my opinion. But I'm going to read it anyways. This one is titled Domain. After every travel, I return home to a much smaller garden. This is what felt so enormous and unmanageable, I wonder when I see it. My north, my south, my east and west, my working week and my Sunday rest. It embarrasses me to discover that it isn't vast and glorious. My domain is a flat suburban yard, partly paved with concrete. There would seem to be no room for variation, but I've studied the angle of light at so many hours, have disrupted the surface of this plot so thoroughly, that in my mind the place is composed of numerous regions. There's the sunny south where the soil is hard and dry, all its moisture leached out by the roots of an old street tree. There's the near north where the soil is solid clay, damp and shaded. Then there's the far north by the alley, the place I used to think of as the wild, thick with waist-high weeds. It was the last region to come under my domain. Pulling the weeds of the wild revealed some resilient hostas, decidedly domesticated. Now it's the region I think of as the UK, cool and moist, populated by primroses. The town I grew up in, Latham, New York, is just inside the garden gate, marked by raspberry canes of the variety Latham, their fragile, sun-warm berries remarkably untouched by time. This garden is big enough to contain my homesickness, as well as my itinerance and my travels. On a sidewalk in Paris, at one of those many markets, I first encountered the translucent beauty of red currants cradled in a little paper boat. Now 3 red currant bushes grow in the west, which is France, and every spring those jewels of the Paris sidewalk hang from their stems, perfectly reproduced. Then there are the regions where I cultivate future travels. Japan, a crimson-leaved maple on an island of mulch surrounded by a sea of hakone grass. It was once flanked by North and South Korea, a pair of viburnums, variety Korean spice, but North Korea was unhappy and had to be relocated to an expatriate community in the Near East, next to Korean feather grasses with pinkish plumes. In among the feather grasses, some stately amaranth has self-seeded. It's native to the Americas, but has been traveling the world for so long that some seed catalogs call it Chinese spinach, though the Chinese call it yin choy and Jamaicans call it callaloo. A small history of humankind, of pre-Columbian trade, of conquest and resistance, of fluid boundaries and durable cultures could be told in amaranth. This may be why the garden feels so big to me. It's an aperture that widens my view. A visitor from France once tested my knowledge of heirlooms and hybrids before asking to see my garden, which was becoming ever more cosmopolitan in conversation, with black Krim tomatoes and red Russian kale, Japanese pink mizuna, Rhino gold zucchini. Seen through a stranger's eyes, standing on the back steps, this all shrank into the provincial late-season vegetable patch that it was, browning at the edges. The visitor paused before saying, "Ah, so this is your domain." It was a joke, domain in French meaning an estate or empire, but it was true, too, domain meaning also, as in English, an area of study. Thank you. So the advice I would give you if you're trying to hide from your project that's about land politics is to not go into gardening to hide, because land politics will find you there, which is what happened to me in this piece. I was thinking of this when Melissa Febos talked about thinking she was going to write a light piece about a cuddle party that turned into like a devastating foray into consent. That happens to me all the time. This is called Lifted. Choose where to plant your peony carefully, the advice goes, because peonies don't like to be moved. Or lifted, as gardeners say, a euphemism for unearthing and uprooting a plant, violating its nature. Plants, like houses, aren't made to be moved. Not long after the house on the corner was bought from the bank, I saw a woman digging some peonies out of the yard and putting them into grocery bags. "I didn't know you could move peonies," I said to her, stopping on the sidewalk. Me being white, this landed badly, as if I was accusing her of lifting the plants in the sense of stealing. She straightened up into her full, well-dressed height and told me this house had been in her family for 3 generations. Her grandfather had built it. Her family had held on to it as long as they could, but she moved away years ago, and the house became a burden, so she had to let it go. These were the peonies she remembered from the spring times of her childhood. She wasn't going to take them all, she said, but I wish she would. Before the bulldozers raised that yard, I'd already lifted 2 of my peonies, poorly placed in the deep shade of a tree that hadn't been there when the peonies were planted 50 or 70 years ago, probably by the same German immigrant who built my house in the 1930s. By then, black families couldn't purchase houses on this block or the next, but those who had come here before 1900 remained. The peonies in my yard had roots like I'd never seen, like half-charred slabs of driftwood that had been embedded in clay since the Pleistocene. It was impossible not to break them, and what I lifted was a collection of damaged fragments. The house on the corner was sitting vacant then, for sale again by the people who had bought it from the bank. That was the year a black businessman spent $1 million to buy back a plot of land 2 miles north of here, land that had once belonged to black families who were forced to relocate in the 1920s. Some of them took their houses, lifted them, and somehow carried them to lots within the red line. They told people they could have the house, but they couldn't have the land, one of their descendants reported to our local paper. His grandparents had planted an elm in the yard they were made to leave, and now it towers above that yard, its upper branches reaching to the edge of the garden the businessman planned as a memorial to the families who lost their land. By the time the new sod was unrolled on the corner lot, now unnaturally flat and void of peonies, I knew something of what it cost a peony to be lifted. The fragments I replanted had set up crimson shoots that spring, but the leaves unfurled into unfinished shapes, and the buds shriveled before they could bloom. The house on the corner, which had been lifted off its foundation and set on metal posts so that it hovered in the air while a new foundation was built, now had a new roof and a new interior too. Walking past it, I crossed paths with the mailman, who nodded to the house and said, "Only one left." At first I thought he meant only one house with peonies in the front yard, but he meant only one house in disrepair. It was 3 doors down, standing empty now, with broken windows, a collapsed porch, and tarps over the roof. Like the house on the corner, it had been owned for 3 generations by a black family before it was lost to the bank. At the far end of the block, on the other corner, is the biggest, grandest peony in the neighborhood, in the front yard of a house owned by a black man who keeps an immaculate lawn with precision edging. Thank you. So, writers are my favorite audience to read for, really the only audience I want to read for. And whenever I read for other writers, I like to read something that's a rough draft or in progress. And so those others have already made their way into Orion, but this one is brand new. I wrote it right before coming here. And thanks to Jonathan for putting its accompaniment up on the screen. This is a photo from my garden that was sent to me yesterday. Those grapes have been swelling enormously while I'm gone. And this piece is, along with this photo, is a kind of like memorial to my garden. I'm moving away next week. I'm leaving it behind. And so this piece is what I wrote as a kind of goodbye to the garden. There'll be more gardens, don't worry. I've had a lot of gardening, many gardens in my past. Most of them were community gardens, school gardens, other people's gardens. So, yeah, I know gardens can happen all over the place. This piece is called The Plan. Leaving a garden is like leaving a marriage. It's an abandonment of the plan. The plan which, in the perennial garden, extends beyond death. When we were planning our first backyard perennial garden, reads the introduction to successful perennial gardening, a visitor from England told us that it takes a minimum of 50 years to create a garden, and if possible, one should allow 200 years. The garden is Gaudi's cathedral, which he knew he would never live to see completed. Even so, it's hard to leave. I walk from window to window, wondering if I'll ever live anywhere again where what I see from each room is the trees I've planted. I dug into the dense clay for them, the digging an act of devotion to what? To the future? Time is what you garden in the end. Plants come and go, but time continues. The rhododendron in the corner by the U was a long time coming. I studied that corner for a decade, considering my options, auditioning some failures. During the heat of summer, the rhododendron recedes into shade, but when it blooms in April, it lives in a ray of light that illuminates every blossom, just as I planned. How much of the pleasure of making a garden is in the plan? It's a collaboration with God. You plant your bulb, a prayer cased in tissue-thin skin, prone to rot, dropped into the damp earth, and then months later, the prayer is miraculously fleshed forth in petals. Once, thinking I would teach a lesson on miracles, I arranged for every child in the 5th grade to plant a giant allium bulb outside the entrance to the school. A crowd of purple globes waited for them on the day of their graduation, as I had planned, but I had not planned for the empty schoolyard of the pandemic. Your graduation flowers are blooming, I still say to my son every year, though he no longer remembers the bulb or the plan. I've visited formal gardens in France where the plan is the garden. Thick with hardscaping, those are gardens of pea gravel and antique hothouses, of stone basins and elaborate fountains. The plants are almost an afterthought. They must assert themselves, like the bristle of cardoons in Jardin de Plantes, huge and spiky, contained within a tidy bed, iron-edged, that comes to a point where two paths divide. Pressed within the pages of successful perennial gardening, I find several hand-drawn plans for a bed in my backyard. That bed is full and flourishing now, but the plans seem not to have been successful. I planned asters that were destroyed by rabbits, and I planned poppies in too much shade. Against the advice of successful perennial gardening, I planned plants that preferred moist soil next to plants that preferred dry soil. I wanted to plant garlic among the daffodils, strangely, but I never did. Only the echinacea and the bee balm survived my plans, fitting in that bee balm is what thrives in an abandoned garden. The plan, I understand, has already been abandoned many times over. Have I learned to meet the conditions? Am I yet a gardener? The Concord grape, which required 3 years of preparatory pruning, has proven too much to handle, too heavy for the wires anchored in the brick of the house, too absurdly robust. It will damage the screens on the windows, but it's already forming the grapes that will ripen after I'm gone. There's a kind of garden I've always loved but never allowed myself. It's the garden of whim and improvisation. Whirligigs spin in the wind, rebar is put to sculptural purposes, stuffed animals are inexplicably affixed to fence posts. There's a rusty machete in the shed, but the pokeweed is in its glory, claiming its place as an ornamental, attracting birds with cascades of inky berries. In an ambitious moment, someone dug a small pond, which is now thick with algae and alive with frogs and mosquitoes. This garden is not for show. The plants run it. They're shoulder high, brimming with vigor, of another epoch. This is the kind of garden that draws complaints from neighbors, that brings down the property value, that attracts rats. And this is where I'm headed now, into the tall grass of the unplanned. Thank you. And I'm delighted to introduce Alicia Stallings. Thank you.
Hello. And thank you again, Leah, Adam, Travis, my partner in crime, Tarfia, our wonderful fellows, Paul and Kinsale, in our workshop. Someone asked me, maybe at lunch, maybe you are one of those people, had I written anything while I was at Sewanee, or was I doing any writing? And I was sort of stunned. I just was like, there's no time for that. But then I thought, well, actually I have been kind of composing something as I've been walking around. A kind of earworm has happened in my brain. I have a very complicated and not entirely positive relationship with technology. But probably all writers, but especially poets, I really love having this bird app. Do people have the bird app? I'm not talking, I mean, this, and I'm holding it around as I'm walking, and I'm, hearing the eastern towhee, and, the Carolina wren, that's a loud little bird, and, northern cardinal and all that. And anyway, this sort of happened. All the poets love the Bird app. They all sign up for it ASAP. Hear a Twitter, give a quick tap. All the poets love the Bird app. Poets love the birds because birds slap. Nightingales are quite the night cap. Even ravens get a good rap. All the poets love the Bird app. If your knowledge has a birds gap, or your ignorance a blank map, you should sign up for it ASAP. All the poets love the Bird app.
Poets love the birds because birds slap. Nightingales are quite the night cap. Even ravens get a good rap. All the poets love the Bird app. If your knowledge has a wee gap, or your ignorance a blank map, you should sign up for it ASAP. All the poets love the Bird app.
That was on one rehearsal. That piece, as you might guess, is called Merlin. Thank you, Sean and Jonathan. And it is very polyphonic. You're walking around, they're all the birds, but the Bird app, you can figure it out. So I flew here from Greece, and I had lots of things to pack, and one of the things that I did not pack was any of my own books, which I realized today. So I will be reading exclusively from uncollected poems. So I didn't bring my selected, although my selected poems, which is my most recent book of poems, is not my most recent book. And I loved what Eula was saying about the kind of cheat project. Usually poetry is my cheat project from reviews or whatever, but then my cheat project from that ended up being a nonfiction book. So I have this, if you want to get a book of nonfiction by a poet, it's called Freeze Frame, and it's about poets and the Parthenon. And this poem is about the Parthenon. So right before, rewind our brains, right before the election in those before times, Celeste Marcus from the journal Liberties contacted me, and she said, we are going to do a symposium at Liberties online, right after the election about, what that means. And I was like, I don't know what's going to happen. I had, memories from 2016 and how I felt that day. And I'm like, this could not go well. And then I don't know that I want to promise to contribute a poem the next day. So I said, no, I don't know, maybe. Then things happened, and I was distraught and was trying to figure out how to get through the day. And I was like, well, I guess I may as well write this poem. So I did that. But I was like, I can't write a poem about the election or about American politics. So it's about that, but it's actually, or either way, it's about the Parthenon. And I figured I could write about the Parthenon. And the current title, this is mostly, this was just written and it wasn't revised, and, this is just what it was. I did have changed the title. So this is called Ostrakhan, Waking Up in Athens After an Election. An ostracon is a piece of pottery that someone then uses to write on. So I kind of like that idea of, writing on this, repurposing a surface. But it was in Athens, in 5th century Athens, it was used when a politician had kind of outworn their welcome or had become really problematic. Instead of impeachment or whatever, people would ostracize them. They would write their names on the ostracon, and if you got enough ostraca, you had to leave the city for 10 years. Anyway, it's not a bad thing. Anyway, I'm seriously thinking of, I basically do have a kind of new book of poems that I'm kind of working on. I'm thinking of calling it Ostracon. I know how people think about that. If you are going to use that title for your book, I have dibs. So I wake up in the dark. In dark, I went to sleep. There is a kind of stark accounting of lost sheep. The day breaks with a dawn, so much like yesterday's. I turn the kettle on and brew a dark malaise. Things go from bad to worse. Let's call it entropy. The blessing is a curse, and treachery goes free or something. Never mind. Here in the cradle of democracy, I find there's history enough. There on the shining rock, the antithesis of state, the subtle curves that lock the crooked to the straight. The centuries turned low around its solid scenes. It took one night to blow the roof to smithereens. It boasts of Marathon. It boasts of Salamis. 4 generations on of hemlock's bitterness. Between the city nations of Greeks warred tribe with tribe. Why trouble with invasions? It's easier to bribe. We still read Athens' versions as though the Spartans lost, as though the prudent Persians did not know what they cost. Pericles died of plague and Phidias in prison. Divisions sown and vague suspicions have arisen. It took 9 years to build those columns in the air, but half its marbles spilled some 70 to repair. It's like a foundered ship, that ruin on the hill. It makes my heartbeat skip. I'm afraid it always will. So, if you want to write a great poem about the moon or love or death, those spots are largely taken. I'm not saying you can't, but it's crowded up there on Parnassus. So one of the things you can do as a poet in breaking new ground is kind of unusual or new subject matter. I think this is one of very few poems about anosmia, which is, I don't know if you had COVID and you lost your sense of smell. So this is a poem about losing your sense of smell. And I've had several people come up to me, is that the first poem about anosmia? I suspect it isn't, but it's, probably like one of 4. Anosmia. Without it, what is lemon? What is mint? Coffee and chocolate, caffeinated brown. Ghosted by a sense that takes no hint, I feel let down. It's hardly tragedy that I can't tell the milk's gone off, eggs rotten. It's no joke with other things, though, no internal bell that signals smoke, the toast burnt or the house on fire. Sweet I have and bitter, I have sour and salt, but without smell, no flavor is complete. There's no gestalt. It's something I'd predict of old age, this weaning from the welter of the world, the better perhaps to leave it. I'm no sage. I'd rather the impearled jasmine flowers, fragrance of the stars light up the brain's gray matter, and the hurt of memory, the human musk of ours in an unwashed shirt. To have a nose for, isn't it a skill, a wry intelligence, a kind of knack? What thought trails do I lose, untraceable? What wisdom lack? I miss the laundry scent they call unscented. Like a depression, it makes it hard to write. What is less, less there, half uninvented, and I, not quite. But there are days I almost have a whiff. I slice a lemon open for the crisp, sun-saturated redolence and sniff and stand in the eclipse. The COVID lockdowns in Greece were very, very strict. Like, you had to text the government to leave the house. You couldn't be more than 2 kilometers from your house. They eventually kind of opened up things a little bit. You could text a shop to buy things, and when we got a little bit of freedom in that way, the one thing I wanted to get was a jigsaw puzzle. I wanted a big, good jigsaw puzzle. I unfortunately bought the hardest jigsaw puzzle in the world. It took like 3 years to do it, and in the end, I think one of my son's friends finished it, and so lockdown puzzle, Hakusai's Great Wave off Kanagawa. You do not want thousands of pieces of that. Even the border escapes me. There are pieces of the sky I cannot seem to put my finger on. The wave about to dash the boats to pieces is dashed to pieces. The pieces are shaped like fractals of flying sea foam. The outside of the box offers what might be pieced together. The wave lifts white and Prussian blue, while the sky lies flat and beige as the raw cardboard inside the box. The wave stands taller than a snow-topped mountain and those 3 boats slung low in the troughs. Rows of fat white dots, like white dots of foam, are the round tops of the heads of fishermen who are looking not overhead at the crest about to crash, but down into the lurch of the sea where they are likely to be drowned amidst a hissing mess of foam and wreckage. The puzzle lies spilled, shipwrecked on the table, all flotsam and jetsam, a piece of boat here, a mountaintop there, sky and wave all jumbled, the edge aligned with the horizon of the tabletop's steep drop. It comes over me in waves, this failure to put together the big picture. I had thought the working of it would give me a feeling of what? Peace, a fitting way to pass the time, a sense of pleasure in the making sense of things. The table is now no use as a surface. For months now, it is all puzzle. The white shapes of water, shaped like random spindrift spinning across the beige ground of the table or the cardboard-colored sky, fragments of yellow boats and blotches that could be seafoam, snowflakes, or bowed heads. Maybe nothing finally locks the surface into an illusion of its smoothness, even if I rhyme each shape with its absence, even if I finish this wave, its monstrous gesture. After, would not my giant hand be another, crumbling the world about to crumble, sweeping the confusion back into its box. For years, I had tried to write a crown of sonnets, not like the really big, heroic crown of sonnets, but just like the 7 crown of sonnets. It seems like as someone who writes a lot of sonnets, this should not be hard to do, but it turns out you kind of have to have a 7-sonnet worth topic. And I'd also, for years, been wanting to write about crown shyness. I mean, this poets love crown shyness. You know, that thing where the trees grow and you look up and they're huge, but somehow they don't touch at the edges. They kind of know where each other is, and there's this little tiny gap of sky. And I had tried to write about that, and I would get 2 poems, and that didn't work. So finally, kind of what clicked was thinking about Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and trees. So this is called Crown Shyness. The ancient epics do not overlap. Hector dies. Achilles is a ghost. The wooden horse is backstory at most or hasn't happened yet. A witch's trap turns men to swine. A living river burns. A dog lies pining on a heap of dung. A woman waits and is no longer young. A ransom's paid. A wanderer returns. So great trees grow, they tell us, putting down a map of roots that charts the underworld as deep as topmost leaves reach up, unfurled into the blue sublime, and side by side, though deep and tall, they only grow so wide and hold aloof, not touching at the crown. They hold aloof, not touching at the crown. Walking between their columns, look above to see how skies a river delta of blue leaking through as puzzled light sifts down. How do they know? How do they sense the touch? We call it shyness. Is it courtesy, an antique courtliness of tree to tree that somehow knows the border of too much? When Priam in his laden wagon came under the veil of night to meet his foe and by the body of his son laid low, Achilles drew back from his savage brink to courtesy and said, "We are the same, though princes, we are mortals. Eat, drink. Though princes, we are mortals. Eat, drink." So all that bloodshed ends in a shared feast, stories, tears. Dawn kindles in the east, the westering stars go ashen as they sink. As neutral birds erupt in morning choirs, mules shake their ears, their hides atwitch with flies. There's nothing for the living but to rise and to prepare the wood for funeral pyres. The forest groans and braces for the axe. So many trees it takes to burn a man. 9 days they gather wood from every side. Between the trees there open up dirt tracks for mules and sledges. Now the thwacks allied in rhythms that no bard has ever scanned. In rhythms that no bard has ever scanned, the timber falls. It's timber when it falls and crashes into silence with its calls of bird song and its rustling saraband. A library of turning leaves, its rings a record of the years no needle traces, shade the annihilating sun erases, torn from the catalog of living things. It started with a catalog of ships, whole forests felled for keels, masts, spars, oars, hulls, made black and waterproof with tar and pitch. The sight of the armada stirred the pulse of men more than the hair, the skin, the lips of beauty's queen, men later called a bitch. The beauty queen, men later called a bitch. She called herself that sometimes. Stood aloft upon the ramparts while the old men coughed and young men died and thought how it was rich. No wedding could go off without a hitch. Men blamed her for their bloody-minded slaughter. She missed her ex sometimes. She missed her daughter. She'd go to Egypt and become a witch. There on the wall, a fig tree grew. Its shade in summer made the city street a park where all the little Trojan children played, chasing each other round the wall, all games until their mothers called as it grew dark, and they became a litany of names. The shades became a litany of names. They creep up to the trough of blood to drink. And now the fog clears. They can speak and think. His mother nears to say she never blames him for her death of, hear her sigh is sharp, a mother's broken heart. His father, well, he lives in squalor, half a man, a shell. His wife, she plays those suitors like a harp. Someday he'll show his father, as he grieves, the orchards he was promised, 13 pears, 10 apple trees, 2 scores of figs and vines that make the best home brew a vineyard bears, not strong as Agamemnon's sea-dark wines, but sweet and bright like light through olive trees. Sweet and bright like light through olive trees, the dawning of his homecoming. Yet still she doesn't recognize him, but she will, unless it is deception that she weaves. Has someone moved the marriage bed? What brute, he starts to say, and then he sees she smiles and knows they are well wedded in their wiles, bed carved from one tree, anchored at the root. In sleep, though, king and queen are like 2 oaks, grown deep and tall, and yet not touching quite. One dreams of battle, one of breaking yokes. One hears house sparrows, one the rhythmic slap of oars. One ravels, one swims waves all night. Their ancient epics do not overlap. As you know, I'm a writer largely of poems in received forms. I like to write not only in iambic pentameter and so on, but I really enjoy syllabics. I think they're a fun way to have those arbitrary pressures that condense and make the poem stronger, but they might not sound as sing-songy as some things. So this is, I think this will be my last poem. It's a poem that's about nature and it's about current events. I was trying again to write a series of poems. Anytime I try to write a series of poems, I write 2, and 2 is not a series. So, I was thinking of these words that we use in our, ecological degradation that are sometimes quite poetic. The cloud, it sounds so light and airy. I mean, it's actually a huge, horrible, windowless building. And one of those things is ghost nets. So living, next to the Aegean, or anyone who lives next to water, there are plastic nets that just wander the seas, catching things and killing them, and just doing all of this harm. And they're called ghost nets, but I really love that term, ghost nets. Maybe it catches ghosts. And I'd started writing solely about it as a kind of ecological thing, but around the time the poem wasn't working, we had a terrible migrant ship disaster off of Sandy Pylos, where hundreds maybe of people, asylum seekers looking for a better life, drowned in this ship. And also Pylos, that area of the Aegean is the deepest part of the Aegean. It's deeper than where the Titanic is. And my husband, a journalist, went and covered it and talked to some of the survivors, so some of those details come into here. If you're listening for the syllabics, these are in haiku-shaped stanzas. I know they're not haiku. Haiku-shaped stanzas. Ghost nets. Pale syllables drift through the ear, reticulate and mercurial as moonlight's ladder glitching across the water. Skeletal rigging of a doomed schooner crewed by the damned, the phantom lace of mermaids who have evanesced to spone-white spindrift, foam scudding leeward, uncanny descant of whales braiding down the spiral Fibonacci staircase of the hollowed nautilus sea dingle of the eldritch sea witch, her garden of stings and fleshy polyps crisscrossed with neon wiggles, the triremes open rib cage spilling amphorae checkered with coin light, or do they involve instead the waterlogged souls of drowned migrants locked in the rust bucket's vomitous hold, mothers and minors, cohort of 17-year-olds held for ransom by smugglers till families paid $4,000 a head for their son's passage to nowhere, the deepest trench off sandy Pylos, to be chum, sea-worm mumbled queasy shades thridding wakes of super yachts and ferry boats sardined with red blistered tourists. Yet they're real, frayed webs of nylon filaments cut loose to sleepwalk like zombies through the seas, snaring loggerhead turtles, dolphins, birds, squid, fish, claws, scales, cartilage, ghastly trash. What's ghosted is the future oceans of unlife, grimed and slimy, starved, hypoxic, bathwater warm. Drastic measures are needed, they've been saying as long as I can remember, making their plastic promises. It went sour in my lifetime, children. Something untangles and comes undone, but not the concatenated, undecomposing mesh of permanent slaughter. We watched it happen.